Well, hello everyone. I hope you're having a great day. Today we're going to be covering the basics of HTML and CSS. I'm so excited to be here for your first module. I'm Gray Lewis. I'm a full stack software engineer, and I've been working as a professional software engineer since I was 16. I've been coding for a lot longer than that. So hopefully I'll be able to give you guys some insight into what HTML does to how HTML and CSS come together to build a website. And yeah, we'll be building up a little foundation for you guys to get started with your mean stack development. Yeah, I'm super excited to get started. Also, I want to let you know that each of you will be assigned a mentor who you will have some additional one-on-one time with to go over the projects throughout the course, and they'll be able to give you specific feedback and help you debug and etc. So you'll have some one-on-one time with them, and of course I'll be here for the entire lesson to ask questions to. And if you're having any difficulty with anything that I'm talking about during the lecture at any point, please feel free to interrupt me or send a message in the chat, and I'll do my best to get around to everyone's questions. Can everyone see the presentation all right? So yeah, as I said, I'm Gray Lewis, but at the end of the presentation, I'll be giving you my Twitter handle, and if anyone has any questions after the class, outside the class, please feel free to reach out. I'm always available, always excited to talk to people about software at all times. So yeah, don't be shy. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about how we really define the measurements that are going to make up the CSS, which will style a web page. So if anyone here has any familiarity at all with HTML, you'll understand that it's basically a hierarchical structure of elements that are going to build up a web page, and then we have CSS, which is going to provide our web page with additional information regarding the look and the style of those elements on that page. And so for things like positioning elements on a page and telling the elements how big, how wide, and how tall to be, these are really the units that we'll be using to define those numbers. And so the most obvious that you're all probably familiar with to some extent is the idea of a pixel. And that's really going to line up with the pixels on your screen. But a lot of the time, since we're going to be constantly dealing with different screen sizes and worried about responsive web design, making sure that people on their phones can use it, and making sure that people on laptops and desktops and big screens and 4K screens, they all need to display the content in a way that's understandable and pleasant to the eye. And so these units allow us to get a little more flexible with how those widths and heights are defined relative to the width and height of what we call the viewport, which is the screen real estate that the web browser has access to. So the web content is being rendered on a certain viewport, and that viewport is going to define how these units work. So we have here the percentages, and so you can see here we have this is the syntax of CSS. We have an identifier which is going to tell the CSS which elements we're referring to, and then we have a property here, width, which is defined as 30%. That means that this element will take up 30% of its parent element, or it will be relative to the viewport if it's a top level element. And additionally, when it comes to font sizes, you can also define with percentages, and that will be relative to the font size of the parent. And now when we go over here to the VW and VH numbers, these are also a lot like percentages, but they completely ignore the hierarchical structure. So now we're not defining as a percentage of the parent or the viewport. This is just of the view width or the view height. So here we have a width on a class on an identifier, which is defined as 30 view widths, which means that it will be 30% of the total viewport width. So that's regardless of where document this element is being defined, what that element's parents are or children are. This is going to be 30% of the viewport width. So if I open a web browser on my computer, it's going to be 30% of that monitor, that screen that I'm using, the width of that, assuming my web browser is maximized. And then finally, we have EMs, which are also super useful. They are equivalent to the currently set font size of an element. So this is really great for things like setting padding within an element. So if we have a box and there's text inside that box, and we want to add a little bit of space around that text, using defining that space relative to the text inside that box is going to be really, it's going to create a feeling of consistency in the visual design of your web page. So remember these three units that we can use when we're styling HTML elements with CSS. You need to remember EM, percents, and view widths and view heights. Those are the three most useful units, in my opinion. And now we're going to move on to the position property. So as I was saying earlier, CSS, it tells us the width and the height of elements, but it's also going to tell us where on the page that element is going to lie. And there are actually a few different ways that we can instruct the CSS to calculate that, given our actual numbers that we put in. We have static positioning, which is the default. And if you look down here, you can see how we actually tell the CSS which positioning style we want to use, for lack of a better term. We have static, absolute, and relative. These are the three major ones. And so static, you can imagine that as it renders your elements in order, and each element is going to take up a certain amount of that page space. And that, and then any number that I put in, any instructions that I give about how far from the top or the bottom it is going to be relative to that understanding. And then if we use relative, or sorry, actually with static positioning, it's not gonna be relative to static. It's going to be just that. It's going to be wherever it falls during the rendering process. It's going to be pushed by other elements in that page, and it's going to be, the position is going to be decided through that process. And then if we move on to the relative positioning, we're going to be able to have static positioning, and then apply nudges up, down, left, and right from that position. So we can take the default and then just move it up 10 pixels, down 10 pixels, left 10 pixels, right 10 pixels. And then when we're talking about absolute positioning, now we're doing it relative to the viewport. So if I say that I want an element to be positioned 50% from the left, then it's going to be 50% from the left side of my browser window. This is regardless of where in the hierarchy this element is. It's going to be absolutely positioned relative to that first positioned parent. So not necessarily the viewport, but it's going to be, absolute. It ignores all the other elements that are on the page. It ignores everything else except the value and where the first positioned parent is. So as I was explaining earlier, an HTML document is a hierarchical set of elements. And one of the element that is give the first element in that hierarchy from the top down. So you can imagine we're talking maybe about the child of a container, right? That child's positioning is going to be defined relative to the parent's positioning. Because, you can imagine if I have a little card, maybe imagine that it's even this card that I have here in my presentation. If I want to position the text inside of that box, then I want it to be relative to that box. I don't want it to be just randomly positioned. I need it to be inside of that, but it will be absolute within that box. So all of its siblings, we should say, all of the other elements that are contained within that parent element are going to be ignored. I see that someone asks if we're starting with HTML or CSS. I'm trying to give a brief overview of CSS because I don't necessarily think that we have to have too much HTML knowledge to dive into CSS. And I feel like CSS is really the bulk of the knowledge. But if anything I'm saying is unclear and there's any questions about how HTML fits into this ahead of time, I'd be happy to answer those questions. So yes, as I was saying, so these position modes, they are really defining how these specific values affect the element's position. So we have top, left, right, and bottom as CSS properties on every element. And then given this positioning mode that we're using, it's going to affect the position differently, as I explained before. So here we have an example where I'm setting position with position absolute. If I tell it to move to the left and to move a certain amount down from the top, it's just like this. And you don't need to set top, left, right, and bottom. I only need to set top or bottom, right? Because they're essentially on the same axis. They're telling me the same information. It's just easier or simpler to calculate it relative to the one that's smaller typically. So here I'm doing it relative to the top because that's closer and it makes slightly more sense. And then the two next most important CSS properties that we're going to be paying attention to are margins and padding. So as I mentioned before, padding, it's going to add a little bit of space within your element. So we have margins, which are going to say, all right, I want to have maybe 500 pixels between the left side of our viewport and this element. And that's going to be a margin. So I'm adding space around the element. And then padding is kind of the inverse. I'm adding a margin for the content within my element. So it creates space inside the element. So here's a little visual example. We have the margin here, which is offsetting this box from the side of our page. And then here we have padding, which is actually deciding how much space the content inside of our element here is given around the edges. So yeah, is there any clarifying questions about what I've gone through so far? I'd also be happy to maybe touch back through the CSS points if people are confused without the basic understanding of how HTML works. All right, EM percentages and view width and view height. Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to quickly touch back on those quickly. Yeah, so EM, just to quickly review, is one EM is equivalent to the font size that you have set. So you can literally just think of this as like a Word document, right? Like our font size is 16 pixels, maybe. 1 EM then in that case is going to be 16 pixels. For percentages, it's going to be calculated relative to the size of the parent element, or if that percentage is on a font, is defining the size of a font, it will be relative to the font size of the parent element. And it's just exactly what you'd think. 33% is going to be 1/3 of the width of the parent element. And then when we go to view width and view height, as I said before, and I'm happy to try to give a clear definition if it's a bit unclear what the viewport is. But a view width is defined as 1% of the viewport width. Sorry, a viewport width is 1% of the viewport's width. So here we can imagine this screen here as my viewport. If I had a browser open on this page and it was maximized, then this entire screen here would be my viewport. So if I define this element's width as 30 view widths, that means that it's going to be 1/3 of my entire screen. So that's useful because it allows us to ignore where in the hierarchical structure we are. So so we're going to be in percentages, it's relative to the parent element. And with view widths and view heights, it's relative to the entire browser window. An example. Sure. I'm actually going to run back through this information while doing some actual coding live on my screen. And I'm going to have you guys follow along with me. So hopefully that will be a good time to be going with some examples. So moving forward, I'm really just barely touching on this concept of flex boxes, but I think it's something that you should be thinking about from the beginning when you're learning CSS, because you can imagine as these web pages become more and more complex and there's more and more like levels to the hierarchy, and more, you know, boxes inside of boxes and text inside those boxes and etc. Organizing the positioning and the margins and the padding, all of that, it becomes a really complex task. And it also creates this issue where maybe messing with one part of your style for a web page is going to mess up the entire structure of your web page. And so flex boxes, they come through to give us some really powerful utilities and can kind of automatically, in a way, calculate a lot of these values for us. One really great example is the justify content property. And you can, and I'm really not trying to go too in depth about how flex boxes work on the level of actually all of the different ways we can configure flex boxes. But you can see here a very basic demonstration, right? So I have a flex parent here with this little outline, and these children, all we have to do is say, we define the justification of that flex box to be to the start of the flex box, and it's going to just shove everything to the beginning. If we set it to end, it's going to shove everything to the end. And this is key. If we tell it to center things, it will center them, and it will center them perfectly. And as you'll come to find when you work on the project that you're going to be working on after this, in CSS, centering things is surprisingly difficult. Centering things is going to be a challenge you'll probably constantly be dealing with and having to reteach yourself a bit at the beginning. And there are a lot of different circumstances in which you have to use different approaches to center things. So it does get frustrating. Yes, so this little outline box here is what we would call the parent element. And these three boxes here are the children elements. And yes, sorry, that was in reference to a question in the Zoom chat. And yes, so to define a parent element as an element that should use the Flexbox system, we just set the display property to Flexbox, and then we can define a few very basic. These are a couple of the most basic flex properties that we can use. We have justify content, or actually, let me explain one more thing. So any Flexbox is going to have two axes, right? It's the vertical axes. We have a vertical axis and we have a horizontal axis. And in a Flexbox, we have to define which one of those axes are our primary axis. So in a column, the primary axis is the vertical axis. In a row, the primary axis is the horizontal axis. Makes a lot of sense, right? And so then we have these two properties to tell the Flexbox how to align the children of this Flexbox along those primary and secondary axes. So justify content is going to tell the Flexbox how to align content on that primary axis. Here in this example I've written, we have the primary axis being horizontal because the flex direction that we've set is row. And then align content is going to define the way that content is laid out on the secondary axis. So in this example, the align content property would determine how this box's children were aligned on the vertical axis. And then yes, flex direction defines which axis is the primary axis. I'm seeing in the chat, yes, the question is, are we going to use multiple flex boxes for a layout, or are we going to use just one? And it really comes down to what you need, right? So ultimately, yes, you will almost definitely be using more than one flex box on a given layout. But you really should not apply Flexbox to everything. You should use it, only where absolutely needed. It's a very powerful tool, but that means that it's also an expensive tool. And I mean, to be frank, rendering CSS and HTML isn't too computationally expensive, but we still want to be as efficient as we can. And so if you don't need to use a Flexbox, as a rule, don't use it. But where you do need to use a Flexbox and where a Flexbox is applicable, it is extremely powerful. It's going to save you a lot of time and probably ultimately make your positioning better. So yes, you can use as many Flexboxes as you want. Any element can be a Flexbox. Any other clarifying questions? All right, great. So moving on to our HTML segment. In web design, we have a lot of different challenges that we're going to be facing. And one of those challenges is making our website accessible to everyone. A lot of people don't actually use web browsers to navigate the web. A lot of them are going to be using content readers if they're blind. And that means that we have to make sure that our website is consumable without the visual aspect in a way. And there's a lot of other ways that they can be consumed as well. And so the semantic web is sort of a set of standards that is built into HTML5, which try to use HTML not only to define the way that a website looks, but also to describe the content at the same time. So the W3C, the WWW Consortium, the World Wide Web Consortium, they're in charge of defining HTML standards. And they are the ones who outline what these different elements mean in a sense. So in HTML, we have elements, as at this point we've gone over a little bit, and there are a lot of different types of elements, and we'll go over a few in a bit. But just as an example, we have lists, we have images, we have forms where we can put our username and password when we log into websites. We have a whole bunch of different kinds of elements that can exist on a web page, and all of those elements have a specific purpose. And semantic elements, they don't just say this is at this place in the page, but they also say this performs this function. We have here non-semantic elements as an example. The two most basic elements that you'll probably be applying a lot are called divs and spans. So divs are the block level elements. You can think of these as just blocks that are going to fill up the web page. They're the containers. They are going to be the things that are the children of the page, or they don't just have to be the children of the actual page itself, but they are going to be block level elements, whereas spans are inline level elements, which means that they exist within another element and as content of another element. And they only affect the layout within their parent element, whereas divs are going to affect the overall layout. And then here is an example of a couple semantic elements. We have lists, which consist of a parent element, either UL or OL, UL standing for unordered list and OL standing for ordered list. And as you can imagine, defining a list using these elements is going to give a little more information to the devices reading and interpreting that HTML. They know that this isn't just some random text. This is an itemized list, and maybe even that this is an ordered list with, it could be a number order, it could be letter order, but it's going to have an order to it. And then images are inline elements that allow for image formats to be embedded as content in a parent element. Basically exactly what you would imagine. And in both of these cases, the element isn't just communicating, oh, I want to have a bunch of elements inside a parent element. That's why I'm using the list. No, it also goes beyond that to say, this is a specific type of content that is performing a specific function. And these are super, like, the more you can use semantic elements, the more accessible your website is going to be to people who can't see your website in the same way that you can. If they have some disability, or maybe they're just on a weird device like a Kindle. There's all sorts of users who are going to be interfacing with your website in ways you can't predict. And so making it as accessible as possible is really key. All right, and yeah, just to give you a brief preview, the project you're going to be working on is going to be creating a layout for a photo album. I'm super excited to see what you guys come up with. And now I want to go into the live demonstration portion. I see that someone's asking for an example of a div and a span, and that's fair. Those are definitely some of the more confusing and arbitrary elements that we have in HTML. And I will get right into that in the demo section. So I'm just going to stop sharing here. I'm going to open up VS Code, and I'm going to start doing a little demonstration. And yeah, feel free to drop some questions in the chat while I get this set up, and I will address them. Oh yes, what is required in your system to do this project? I was under the understanding that you guys would already have been informed, but I will run through them once more. You should have VS Code, which is, I think, most web developers' favorite and integrated development environment. That's this here. And oh, by the way, can everyone see my screen just fine? Great, yes. So you're going to need VS Code. You're going to need Node.js, which is going to also include Node Package Manager, and you're going to need some way to run a MongoDB instance, either using a cloud instance, or you can also have a local instance. But for this project, you won't need all of that. You'll just need VS Code, but you should have those things installed for the course in general. All right, so let's get started with just a little demonstration of how divs and spans work. So first of all, I want to also give some tips. I'm going to, as I do this demonstration, give some VS Code specific tips of different shortcuts that we can use to speed up writing HTML and CSS. And the first one I'm going to give is about emit abbreviations. These are just little shortcuts that VS Code includes by default, which will basically, they just represent snippets of code that you can just really quickly generate by writing a little shortcut. So if I type an exclamation point, you'll see that VS Code recommends in their little recommendation dropdown this emit abbreviation, which is going to give us boilerplate code for a web page. So these are all of the metadata things that are going to be embedded in the web page in HTML. And this is the body, this is the head. This is basically the lowest level thing, like setup that you would need to have a web page that makes sense. How did I create this file? I just, I create a file like you normally would on a system. In VS Code, you can right click here, create new file, and I just named it index.html. Yeah, any web page that you have, the entry point to that web page should be labeled index.html. And yes, so we have this HTML tag here now. That is the top level tag, which is going to say, this is the beginning, this is where our content is. This is the head tag. Anything inside of this is, it's not the stuff that gets rendered on the page directly, but it is going to be linked information. For example, it's going to be how we tell the HTML where to find our CSS. It's also going to be where we define things like the title of the document. When you have Chrome open and you have all those tabs open, the text that's going to tell you what the name of the tab is, such as Google Docs, Google Drive, that little text that shows up in the tab. That's where this comes from, the title element in your head element. Someone's asking what's the importance of a meta tag. Meta tags give they just give information, metadata about what the web page is. So here we're saying how and what the web page is made up of. And so here we're saying, for example, we're just indicating that the encoding of the text that we're using is the UTF-8 format. And here we are explaining that we are showing that this is a responsive website and that the viewport is based on the device width and some other, low-key information. You don't really need to understand this to build a website. This is really more for SEO, search engine optimization, and also accessibility in some cases. I will be uploading all code from the presentation to Eduonix. All right. So yes, and then inside here, the body tag, this is where the magic really happens. This is where we're going to be defining our elements. So when we are talking about divs and spans, we are talking about generic elements as opposed to those semantic elements that I explained before. So if I do a little div here, but just by typing div as such, and also VS Code's going to do a nice helpful thing for me and autocomplete and create the closing tag. We have two tags in every element, or most elements, some are self-closing, but in most elements we have an opening tag and a closing tag, and anything inside of those two tags is within that element. And now, also let me quickly get this file open so we can see as I make changes. The easiest way and most straightforward way to write CSS, although not the best practice, is to do what's called inline CSS. So we can actually define CSS styles within our HTML document by creating a style element within the, this should actually be in the head, whoopsie. Within the head of the document, we can create a style section. And as long as it's in this style element, then the browser is going to know that we're talking about CSS and not HTML anymore. So I've created this div, this generic element, meaning that it's just an element. We don't know what it's going to be. It's just an element. And then I need to give it an identifier so that I can address it in the CSS. And there's two kinds of identifiers in CSS. There's an ID, which is unique, meaning only this element specifically. So I could name this div1. And then then I just put a hashtag here to indicate that I'm talking about an ID, and I type div1, and now it knows that I'm talking about this div because we have linked it through this identifier here. And although IDs are kind of simple and easy to understand, it is best practice and generally just easier, you'll find as you start making websites, it is easier to use what is called a class identifier, which is the second type of identifier. So here, this isn't unique. There can be any number of elements that are given this class name, and they will all be styled by the CSS that I apply to this identifier. So for this example, let's just make some squares. So I could also duplicate this again, and that's fine. Now, both of these are going to be styled the same way in accordance to the CSS that I'm about to write. And in the CSS itself, we're going, oh, and by the way, sorry, if you want, you should open up VS Code and try doing some of this yourself as I'm coding, and ask me questions if you are trying to follow along and you have any difficulties. I'm here during this class to answer those questions. And yes, someone asked, what is an ID again? It just means that it is unique. Only one element can have one ID. If this was an ID, I couldn't duplicate it because only one element can correspond to one ID. So, all right, so let's get into the styling so I can actually show you how these styles affect it. So we have dot square, which is going to indicate to the CSS that we are talking about a class and not an ID, the dot here. And then we can start actually writing some styles. So if I write width 64 pixels and then height 64 pixels, And then we can also add a background color, black. And then I open up the document here. Can everyone see the web page that we've rendered now? Nice. Just double checking. We can see that we have this little element here, which has a width of 64 and a height of 64. I'm just going to quickly, yeah. So we can see both at the same time. And then, yeah, so it's that simple, right? This is a generic element, meaning we can do whatever we want with it. So if I was going to do a non-generic element here and do an unordered list, and then create some list items inside of that unordered list, and then I can duplicate that a couple times, and then maybe we go item 1, and we just kind of fill this out. So we just have a very basic list. You can see that it has applied some default styles here. And that is because this is not a generic element. This has a specific use. Now we can get rid of these default styles, of course. And most of the time we will. Yes, this is a semantic element, meaning that we have a specific function for this element, a particular use for these elements. These are list items within an unordered list, and that has meaning in and of itself. All right. Any questions so far? Yes, hashtag is for ID and dot is for class. So this is where it gets a little bit more complicated with flexboxes. And I think, you know, even though this is really just the beginning, and the flexbox, I think for most front-end engineers would tell you that the flexbox is probably one of the more advanced concepts in CSS. I do think that it makes a lot of sense to start to some extent with flexboxes because they're a little more intuitive on some levels and they're really powerful and you're going to be using them a lot. Where did I click on the live browser? So to have my content refresh automatically, I actually am using a plugin. I'm going to, I can definitely send a link in the chat after this demonstration so that you guys can also use that if you'd like. So now let's use the squares, but we're going to have multiple squares now. And we'll see how the task of managing elements on a web page becomes more complicated as we extend past just having the one element. And I think someone asked earlier, wouldn't it make more sense during debugging to have everything be an ID? And you'll see why that's actually kind of frustrating. It really makes your code non-reusable. And there's very few times that you're going to have an element that you use only once. Most of the time, there's going to be a whole bunch of things. And yes, you can also just open an index.html document in a web browser, just open your file explorer, drag and drop that onto the browser, but you will have to refresh to see that code update. Here, I just changed the code and it updates for me, which is super useful. Right, so we have a container here and we have 3 squares inside of that container. And I'm going to show you what we can do if we make this into a flexbox. So if I just go display flex, now we'll see it's actually turned it into a row instead of a column. So instead of stacking vertically, it's now stacking horizontally. We can also do a lot of different things now. If I set the width of this to 100%, and then I use flex, if I use justify content center, then we'll see that now it's actually centered it in the web page. And as I said before, centering honestly becomes quite a difficult task at times. And then if we go here and create a margin of 10 pixels, we can see that now we've also separated these squares by 10 pixels from each other. And yes, so you can see the Flexbox, it gives us some super simple tools. We can just justify the content to the center, almost like we're just manipulating text in a Microsoft Word document or on a Google Doc, which you could not do before Flexboxes were added and widely supported. And there's a whole bunch of things that you can do with a Flexbox. You can also change the, you can also use some special values for justify content, like space between. And that's going to make sure that there's an even amount of space that is the maximum amount of space that can be used as well between the elements. We can also do space around, which is going to sort of evenly space them out, but instead of maximizing the space between, it's going to try to put an even amount of space on the both sides of each element, so on the left side and the right side. And there's a few other values for justify content that we can use. And now this is maybe the most important thing you need to know when you're learning CSS and HTML. It is impossible to know all of CSS. You will be Googling every single time that you do web development. You will be Googling how to write CSS. You will forget. You will forget how to do basic stuff. You will forget everything. There is so many rules in CSS and so many different ways that we can approach any problem that the ultimate tool in software development generally, but especially in CSS, is to know how to Google the problem that you're having and figure out how to solve it that way. I'm seeing I am not able to run the code. Yes, you just need to save it as index. It doesn't even have to be an index.html. Just save it as an HTML file. Index.html is sort of what we conventionally use, but you do not have to name it index.html. So yes, save it in the file and just drag that onto your browser window, and then it will open in there. But yes, it's all about Googling and figuring out these things when you are trying to solve a problem. So you might have the question, all right, how do I center something? Just Google that. How do I center something in CSS? How do I center something vertically in CSS? That's going to be the absolute key, because I'll tell you now, I Google a lot of things, and every project that I work on, I will forget the different CSS properties. And obviously, as you learn more, you'll be able to Google less and be able to develop faster. But really, there's all these amazing, rich resources online that are going to detail, all these other developers' experiences with working with CSS and all of the solutions they found. And you're able to tap into all of that knowledge. And that's just ultimately so much more knowledge than you could ever hope to gain. And CSS and HTML and JavaScript are really complex languages. And they have a lot of really finicky, confusing rules sometimes that can be really hard to understand, even if you've been working with it for a long time. All right, so is there anything from the presentation that anyone specifically wanted a demonstration of? We can also try to create a little bit more complex of a layout if we want. We can go over anything anyone is confused about. If not, I'm just going to move on. Can I show a span? Yeah, for sure. So a span, unlike a div, is an inline element. So if I let's change up this square for a second. Let's get rid of this background color and instead add a border to it. And then if I put a span inside of this first square, and then inside of that I just have the words hello. We'll see that it is just this small little thing inside here. And that's because it's not going to be taking up the amount. It's not going to be assumed to be something that needs extra space. It's going to just be the size of whatever the content is. So it's exactly the size of the word hello. And that's useful in some scenarios that you'll find. And it also sort of allows us to define which things are content and which things are structural elements in a way. Can we use classes and IDs together on a div? Yes, you can. If I have a class and an ID on this element, then I could address it either way. But again, using classes allows you to reuse your code a lot easier. And so I really do recommend that. Yes, and great point. I will go through EMs, percentages, and view widths respectively. for sure. But yeah, so we have this inline element here. And I can also do that. And yeah, it's just, it makes things a little bit more tightly packed inside. There's also a bunch of other very specific things about how the CSS styles are calculated on a block element versus an inline element. And also, you can make a div into an inline element if you so desired. You would just have to go display inline. And now instead of being a box, it is an inline element. In this case, that doesn't make much of a difference, but in some cases it would. And yeah, the difference between spans and divs, it's not huge, but one example is if I made this container, if this wasn't a Flexbox, I'm trying to think if it's worth to do this whole, I'll just explain it. Basically, a span does not take up the maximum amount of width by default. It's going to take up the amount of space that it needs for that content. A div, on the other hand, will actually take up as much space as you will give it. So this container, we can right click here and click inspect to see a little more clearly the web page in the browser. This container here, if I toggle off the width 100%, I didn't even really need that because by default, divs are designed to take up the maximum amount of width that it can take. And yes, CSS is not something that can be covered in 2 classes or an entire career. CSS is, I mean, there's so many nuances. No one's gonna 100% understand it, for sure. All right, but yes, let's move on to the view width and view height examples. I do want to, though I think those are really, really key things in CSS, and they're also super useful. And pixels become a little bit confusing when you're shifting between landscape and portrait orientations, like you do when you have a phone versus a desktop. So in this case, we have it as 64 pixels, but I could instead make it 30%. And now you'll see that it's 1/3 of the parent container, which is here. And then if I make this parent container only 80%, it's now responded to the changes in the parent element. And now we are able to see how these different values kind of come together to define a layout. But these percentages are super useful because now if I resize this, it also resizes these boxes along with us. So that means that if we're viewing on a phone and there's not enough width to fit the content that we've defined, that's not a problem because we've defined it relative to the size of the screen that we're looking at. And then if we then, instead of doing the 30%, use 30 view width, and we just didn't define this, then we would see that it is now the viewport width instead of the just percentage of the parent container. We can also even define widths in terms of view heights, which is a little confusing, but you could do that. And you can just define those things however you want. Whatever is the most convenient and useful unit to use on a element is what you should use for that use case. For example, we have some text inside of these squares now. So if I set the font and I go font size is 20px, and then we say that we want a padding of 1em, we've now added an amount of space around this content here that is equivalent to the height of 1 line of text. And I think that's great because I think it does create this sort of consistent feel in the design of a page where, you know, this space is equal to this space, and that makes it feel like it has enough of its own space. And so it also means that if I change this font size here, it still has that nice compact, but still like well feel to the layout. And I think that, defining padding, especially in terms of EM, is a super useful tool that will help you with reusing your code across different elements that might have different font sizes. Yes, view widths and view heights are defined as 1% of the viewport or viewport height or width. So they are exactly like percentages, except when you define in terms of percentages, you're defining relative to the parent. So here, this is the child of this square. If I was to make this first one, let's just do a little example here. What the difference is between a view width and a view height. Or actually, let's just move this out altogether. And then we have this square here. And then we make another container for ourselves. And then we put this square inside this container. And then we make this container here, container 2. We're going to make this have a width of 300 pixels. Whoops. Width 300 pixels. And then we have the square here, and we can see if we... Oh, something's wrong here. It's not detecting the changes in container 2. Let's try stopping the server and opening it again. Strange. All right, whatever. If we define this div inside of it, which we will give the class div, so div 2, so that we can style it that way. Then we can go ahead and define it relative to the width of this container. So we have container 2 here, which has 400 pixels. If I first give this a border of 1px solid black so that we can see it, and then I give it a width of 30%, 33%, so it's 1/3. Then we'll see that it's 1/3 of the parent element. Let's also give that container a border so we can see that too. So we'll see that it's 1/3 now. But if instead of defining it with a percentage, I define it with a view width, then we're now defining relative to the entire browser here. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Cool. And then yes, so yeah, that's the difference between view width and view height. And yeah, I think let's also talk about fonts. That's a super important. Oh, not clear at all. What's not clear? All right. Since there's no clarification from Maurice there, yes, as Sushant says, yeah, I think if you try to actually open VS Code and mess around with it a little bit, it might make a little more sense. Right. So let's talk about fonts. The font properties are font size, font weight, line height, and font family. And we can define those individually. I can say font family is Arial. And now we've seen that the font here is changed. Let's quickly just clean this up here so that we don't have to look at that. We've changed the font here to a sans serif font named Arial. We can also then go font weight is bold. And we've now changed the weight of the font that we're using. But we can also instead do this all at once with what is called a shorthand property. So if I just go font bold 25px Arial, I've now defined all three properties: font weight, font size and font family in one line of code, which is just more convenient. But you can also define them individually. It's also important to note that you can define the same property multiple times and override old values, and it goes from top to bottom. So if I then go font weight under this and then I go normal, we can override this property that we've written here. And so this is useful because if we're reusing the same code and then we want to maybe have an exception to that rule for one specific element, we can then override it later in the CSS style sheet. But it does matter that this is coming after this in the style sheet. And then line height, which is kind of a confusing concept in my opinion. If we give this a defined height, we can see that it's actually this line here is despite, or actually let's also make sure that, yeah, so despite the fact that this div here, div2, is the height of its container, this text is still in the upper left-hand corner. And that ultimately comes down to the fact that we haven't told it, oops, we haven't told it exactly how high and how tall a line of text should be. So if I then define line height to be 80 px, because I just made the same mistake I was talking about before, the order of them really does matter. Now we've defined that the line height is 80 px, meaning that one line of text should take up the entire height, which we've defined here as 80, and we are also then saying the line height should be the full height of the element. So yeah, that can be a bit confusing. There's like so many different levels of styling with the heights and the padding, so many different ways to move. If I just wanted to move this text around, there's so many different ways that I can do that. But it's all about figuring out through practice and trial and error which ones make the most sense in which situations. And so this shorthand property is being overridden by this, and also the line height, despite the fact that the line height isn't even defined in this shorthand property, is by default being defined as, I believe, just 0 in this font, this shorthand property, which is why before, when this was before the font property, it was getting overridden by this other property. So you can see there's all these finicky little things in the way that these different values are parsed together to determine how these things fall into place. Does that make vertical centering easier by using view height? Vertical centering is, yeah, an extremely challenging thing in CSS, which seems crazy because it feels like centering should be basic. View height, it's relative to the entire screen. So it would make it easier if we were trying to center relative to the whole screen, and if our position, if the positioning style lines up. And speaking of which, we will go, I think the next thing we're going to do is an example of the positioning styles, because that's another really confusing one. Yes, so in certain cases, you could use that to vertically center, but in general, not really. Flexbox, like I said, if you, it comes down to making, yes, Flexboxes can center very powerfully in both axes. You can apply Flexboxes to solve that problem. All right, so let's get to a positioning example now. So here we're using position static. This is by default. This is the default. Way that the positioning is calculated. But if I then go absolute, we can see how we can change it. So if I go top 50 px, now we are 50 px from the top left. And then if I go left 50 px, we're now 50 px from the left. So we position relative to the top and relative to the left or to the right and the bottom. Any combination of those we can do. If I was to do relative in this case, it would actually be pretty much the same. But if we were in a different part of the document, right? So if we had a bunch of layers of elements and this was a child within another child, then the absolute would allow us to sort of override some of the weird positioning things that would happen in that case. And yes, but this is very, very basic. We just absolute, it's exactly what it's going to be, the most intuitive positioning style that we have. We just have position is absolute. It's 50% from the 50 pixels from the top, 50 pixels from the left. That's how that would be calculated. We also have some fancier ones, like fixed. That means that if I scroll, it's going to stay the same. But obviously, if we can quickly actually demo that just by adding a min height to the actual body. So now we can scroll through our web page because it's a tall body that we can scroll through now. And if this was fixed, then we'll see that when I scroll, nothing happens. It's going to stay there. That's useful for when we want to do things like maybe have a tool, a navigation bar at the top of our page, for example. The way we enter the properties in order does matter, but only if those properties cover the same attributes of the element. So I'm adding all of these spaces and trying to group them just for my own organizational things. That's just more of a style thing. So I like having my width and height together and all of my positions together and all of my font related properties together, because it just helps me visually navigate the document. That does not actually matter in the way that the CSS is interpreted. But like I said, here the order does matter because we're defining the same property twice. The font weight is already defined in this shorthand property, and then we're overriding it here. So the order in that case does matter. But going back to our positioning example, we have this div now. We have the fancy fixed position, which is actually relatively new to CSS. Yeah, so you can see how these different values are interpreted in different ways when we change the position. These top and left values are changed. And that gets really confusing. Position is one of the more confusing, aspects of CSS. And that's one of those things where you're going to run into confusion when you're developing, and you're going to have to Google how does this specific property affected by the position property that we're using. So right now it's fixed, could be static, relative, sticky, absolute. And those values are going to be interpreted different in all of those. All right, I want to give a little bit of space now for those of you who have been following along. Is anyone having any problems that they want to ask me about? If you're having some confusion and maybe your code isn't working, go ahead and send a screenshot into the group chat. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask some questions for those of you who maybe aren't following along, or those of you who are already caught up and don't have any confusion. I want to just ask some sort of quiz questions and see if you guys have any just see how you guys reply, see how well you guys are understanding. So let's start with a simple one. If I wanted to add some space within this element to make a little bit, to see how this div is all the way to the left of this, what would be the best property to use for that? Does anyone know what the best property to use would be? Hey, that's what I like to see. Awesome. I'm seeing a question here. How is the CSS file integrated with many HTML pages? Yeah. If I have a one portal where I place an image in a different HTML page, the same page, I should see the same image. How does that work? Right, so that's actually one thing I forgot to quickly cover. This is an inline style. So this is attached to the index document itself, the HTML document itself. But we can also do it through an external file. So I've already created this file, style.css, which is empty for the moment. But I can link it by adding a link element into the head, pointing it using the href attribute to style.css, and then letting the link know that the relevance is that it is a style sheet. And then I'm also going to add this just for metadata purposes, that it is a text CSS file. And now I could move all of these styles into this and it would accomplish the same thing. So let's do that now. So if I just go ahead and cut all of this, and then we refresh, it's going to be the same because we've linked this file and now the styles are being imported. That's that's definitely the more convenient and professional way to do it, especially as you have a more complex file structure. You really don't want any one file in your project to get too long. That can be really frustrating. And so having inline JavaScript or inline CSS, although it can be convenient for a tiny little project like this demo, it will get super long. CSS files have a tendency to get really long. And so that would make it really hard to navigate the HTML on its own. And for everyone who said padding to the question, you would be correct. Obviously, there are other ways that you could approach it, but padding is the most logical because it's sort of intended for that purpose and it would consistently apply no matter the size of the screen. And it would also consistently apply no matter where we used that, on what element it was being applied. All right. Does anyone else have any questions? Or is there anything else that you guys specifically want to go over? Are there class files to download for the classes? No, this is not Java. These classes are just, they're identifiers, right? I'm just naming it in a way. I'm just saying, yo, this div is called container 2. And the reason that we call it a class is just to delineate from the idea of an ID. So it's a class of elements because there could be many elements with this name. It's not just one element named container 2. I could create another element named container with the class container 2, and it could style the same but not be the same element. Oh, where do we get the files to see the code? I mean, this example that I'm giving right now is not uploaded because I'm writing it as we go. Rel and type are mandatory to mention. As far as I understand, rel is mandatory. So you do have to explain that this is a style sheet for it to be applied as a style sheet. I'm pretty sure that type is really more about just metadata. So it's important, but not that important. But it's super easy, so just do it. Why do we use the body and not the head? Right, so it's really just sort of to make it make more sense in terms of structure, just to make it more clear. The head is where we put linked files, where we add the metadata, where we set the title of the document. These less, I mean, it's all intangible because it's a website, but these less, these less tangible things in the sense that these aren't getting rendered to the page directly. This title element is nowhere on our page. This link element is nowhere on our page. They are giving the page more information about where the information is. We're saying, yo, we want our styles to come from this document. We want the name of this page is document, etc. Responsive layout later with media queries. Yeah, that actually might be worth going over briefly. But I think the great thing about CSS is that, especially with more basic layouts, like the ones that you guys are going to be setting up for your project, you can really just use these responsive units to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So the view width, view height, and percentage things, those are going to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of resizing. But as Ron pointed out, there are indeed these specific exceptions that we can make using media queries to dynamically change the way that the CSS is rendered based on media queries, like how wide is the screen of the person who's using the website. This is useful, for example, if we are trying to make a mobile version of the website versus a desktop version of the website. And they are typed like this. It goes, I need, see, here I go. I'm hitting Google because a lot of these things just don't, there's just so many things, you can't remember them all. So we can set the max width of our device to 500 px. And then in this little block here, we now have specific styles that are only going to be applied when the screen is less than 500 pixels wide. So just to give a quick example, I could, oh wait, first I got to tell it which element I'm talking about. I could hide everything. And then if the width of our thing is if the width of our screen is a certain amount, then it will dynamically inject these styles here. Do we need to create multiple different versions? So that really comes down to how complex your website is, like whether you would really need to have a whole different version. The key thing to do is throughout the time that you're developing and testing and messing with your HTML and CSS, you just need to try adjusting the size of the window as I'm doing here by just doing that, and we can see how it adjusts. And where you see that the size is breaking the way that you want your website to look, like, oh, now it's collapsing in a weird way and it doesn't look the way I want it to, that's where you need to apply these specific exceptions, these media queries. So at media just indicates that this is a media query. And then now we're talking about, and by media query, what we really mean is that these are properties of the device itself that is accessing the website, the media through which this website is being rendered. And then this is the filter, shall we say, the specific value that we're testing to know if these CSS styles should be applied. So yes, so any case where the screen is less than where the width, the viewport is less than 500, it will override with these styles. So it'll override everything above it, which is partially why I'm writing this media query at the end, because as I said before, we're overriding these values. This will be applied and overwrite any of the values above in that case. So to give an example, maybe we want the text to turn blue when it's less than that width. Then when we get less than that width, it's now blue. Can we use the view width instead of a px in a media query? No, that wouldn't really make sense because how are you going to talk about the width of a screen relative to its own width, right? So we need to have this in pixel values. And the other thing is that generally speaking, these values are going to be based around the different kinds of devices that are going to be using it. So I really need to focus on, or we all really need to focus as aspiring front-end developers on the mobile form factor and the laptop/desktop form factor. So we're going to have one breakpoint probably that's going to, and by breakpoint, I mean this value here, right? So at this point, we're now in a different, we're applying these other CSS styles. That's what we mean by breakpoint. That breakpoint should be around the width of a standard mobile screen. Excuse me. And so, yes, so it really is just about testing where your website breaks down and applying these overrides so that it doesn't break down anymore. You'll find when you're doing your project, your little photo album project, that especially when you're working with, for example, images which have a specific aspect ratio, we can't mess with the width and the height as much as freely as we'd like. We're going to have weird cases where when the screen is too wide or too thin, the layout will just break down and it won't work in the way that we want. And that's especially where these come in handy. And it's all about testing, just trying it in different ways. Open it on your phone, open it on an actual laptop, although this works. Oh, also one important thing. There's a bunch of super useful tools inside of this inspect element tool on Google Chrome, which I highly recommend using Google Chrome if you're not, for whatever reason. I assume most of you are, but Google Chrome's dev tools are specifically great. We can also use this here to emulate the screen size and also the all the metadata coming from an iPhone. So for all intents and purposes, my website now understands this as rendering on an iPhone X. So you can test how it would look on an iPhone or any of these devices, or you can also custom create a fake device or match it to a real device if you want to test a specific device to test when you don't have a real phone. But then you should also at some point try to test it on your real phone so that you can make absolutely sure that there aren't any weird confusions. Can we use it is very panic? What does that mean? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Right. So are there any other questions? I believe we're getting close to the end of the session here. Is anyone who has been working on their following along, do they want to share their code and if they're having any issues with it? How do we use it on a real phone? So that's a good question. Well, the easiest way to do it would be to actually get the index phone somehow, whether that's through WhatsApp or whatever, and then open it in Chrome. But you can also use dev tools to, you can also, I mean, honestly, there are very few cases in which there would be a significant difference between using this tool here, especially when it comes to HTML and CSS. Once we get to JavaScript, there are some other weird finicky things that are going to cause problems. But generally speaking, there will not be, especially for this project, any problems with using this over using your real device. But yeah, so if you're having a problem, if it's a complicated thing to get an HTML file onto your device, you don't have to do that. But you should be able to just open an HTML file on your phone, just like you would on a computer. Is there any emulator for the media query that we can use to test? That's what this is for the media query. This, like in terms of media queries, this is fine. Like this will properly trigger your media queries. You've seen REMs used in your code, and you don't know what that is. As far as I understand, REMs are just the they're the EMs, but for your default style. So like the EM refers to the specific element that we're working on, whereas the root EM or the REM, it refers to the default for the entire document. could I give an overview of inspect in Chrome, please? Yeah, for sure. So this is the inspect element tool. It also has a whole bunch of other things, but the main thing that it allows you to do is just point at an element, right click, inspect, and then you can see in your inspect element window the structure of the overall document as well as the styles here that are being applied to that element. So here we have div2 and we have the style. I can even turn it on and off. I can also write myself some nice little test code. Oh, this is another useful property, text align. That's going to align text within an element. But yeah, so you can see all of these, and you can also add custom styles. This is really good for if you're just like not necessarily writing the code yet, but just confused about which way would be a good way to approach it. Sometimes I'll come in here and I'll add some styles and just see how they affect the element. And then that will tell me which approach would be the best way to style things. And you can also turn things on and off if you're having some weird confusions about how a div is appearing on the screen to sort of test like, oh, maybe this is the thing, maybe this is the property that's causing the issue. And you can kind of just run through like that and get some really quick feedback. And you can also see it can be a bit hard to understand exactly what's going into positioning it in the place that it is, but you can see exactly how it breaks down in this little thing here. You can hover over it and see this is just the width and height. This is the non-existent padding. This is the border. And like this is all sort of the layers, so to speak, of how this element's position and such are being determined. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of other tools that you'll want to cover and use once you get into doing more complex apps. But in terms of HTML and CSS, this is really where we're going to stay. We're approaching the end here, but I do want to cover one more quick thing, and that's the idea of pseudo elements. So pseudo elements are essentially little identifiers that we can use to sort of adjust our identifier here to a more specific identifier that maybe only refers to, here, I'll just give an example because it's kind of hard to explain. So if I go to div2 here and I go div2 hover, then I'm going to do, I'm going to quickly put the background color to gray. And then when I hover over it, it's going, well, we're in the, sorry, because we were in the mobile preview, it looked a little weird. But if I hover over it now, you can see that now only when I hover, it's going to change. And that's super useful. I'm sure you guys have been on websites and noticed this before. And it's great because CSS is quite a simple way to create such nice functionality. For like buttons, especially and things like this, it gives a little feedback. And it also tells the user like, oh, like this is probably something interactive because when I hover over it, it has like a visual change. It's a really good design cue. And then when you design, before and after pseudo classes are a bit too deep, I think, for this introductory HTML and CSS lesson. But if you're interested, just please Google. Sorry if I missed this. When you design, is it best to try to optimize for mobile first, or do you design for a web page and then set up media for smaller viewports? So this really is going to come down to the actual project. There are some websites that won't be used by mobile users. For example, like full desktop applications sometimes are built in the web browser. If they're super complex to use, then it's unlikely people use them on phones. So that's a case where maybe I would go computer first, desktop first. But in general, the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of web traffic is actually coming from phones nowadays. The vast majority really of web traffic, I think it's even above 70% of web traffic is coming from phones. So realistically, going mobile first makes more sense just because you'll be targeting more of your users more effectively. And yeah, so I would say in general, mobile first. The websites which are publicly available, are these all HTML and 5 and CSS, or is there any way to know further? So on a basic level, all websites are HTML and CSS. The question is, how is that HTML and CSS given to our device? Because sometimes the HTML and CSS is dynamically generated by JavaScript in the case of more complex web apps. So in this case, we're doing what is called a static website, which means no matter who is viewing our website, no matter no matter if they're logged in or whatever, there's no login, there's no way to change the state of our website. No matter how this page is requested, the exact same index.html file and style.css file will be returned. So this is raw HTML and CSS, we would call it. I've seen many websites that open entirely in mobile as they open in desktop. How can we bring the same? Well, you actually wouldn't want your website to open exactly the same in mobile as they would in desktop. That would be a problem. You don't want that. You want it to be effective. You want your layout to make sense. If otherwise, like for example, if we set this width here, if we set this height to 10,000 or to like, let's say we set the minimum width to 1,080 pixels, or no, 1920 pixels. Then if I go in here and I try to look at it on a phone, there's going to be a weird, we're going to have the weird problem where now like we have this huge element that we can't even really see. Those are the kinds of problems that are going to happen when we switch between the mobile and the desktop. And that's why we need it to look different when it's on mobile and desktop. The code is publicly available and anyone can use it. Is there a way to secure it, or is this how it works? In part of the beauty of the web, in my opinion, is that, yeah, people can just look at your code, especially when it comes to HTML and CSS. And even when it comes to JavaScript, you can do a lot to obfuscate it, but ultimately, people are going to be able to see it. And that's just the facts. That's how it's going to be. You can do some really fancy stuff if you have a huge project, and a lot of the ultimate logic for your app is not even going to be in the website itself. Often it's going to be on the server, that the front end that the website's connecting to, but that's sort of beyond the scope of this. All right, so unfortunately we have reached the end of this class. If you have any more questions that I did not cover, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or on, I believe I will be able to answer questions on Eduonix, but I'll be more reliably answering on Twitter. I will send my Twitter in the chat. So go ahead and send them there if you have any questions after. We do have class tomorrow. And yes, so as I said before, your project for this week, or for your project that I'm assigning you, is to make this photo gallery. And you're going to be working with your mentors to complete that and get specific advice from them. I hope everything was clear. I tried to answer as many questions as I could. I'm sorry if it wasn't. Please do reach out to me. And I with coding, and especially with getting started, often it really just takes getting your hands dirty. So I really recommend pulling open VS Code and trying to get started with it. But thank you guys so much for being such awesome students. I had a great time. This is the first class I've taught for Eduonix, so this is super exciting, super fun experience. And yeah, I'm really hope that this was helpful for you guys, and I'm excited to see you tomorrow, where we will continue to delve through the mean stack.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you like the video, do give us a thumbs up and share it. Also check out amazing discounts and offers on our premium courses in the description below.